This is episode number 4 of the series with DeWayne to wrap things up here. Instead of focusing on DeWayne as I start this episode, I'm going to kind of focus on the audience here, simply because DeWayne knows this stuff with the summary. I'm going to give a really quick summary of kind of where we've come so far. So last episode, we really started to delve into more of a specific example of an organization that has grown a lot. It's now at around $20 million worth of revenue every year, and there's some excitement there, but we started to see some probably chasms rather that started as cracks. And what are the tools that we can now implement? What can we do to really help this organization hit that next level? What we're going to be doing this episode now is talking about what is that next tier? What is that next level? What does the revenue look like? What does the organization look like? What is the next kind of time or size where an organization is going to start to notice more chasms, or where they're going to start to notice a little more deficiencies or those pain points in the growth process? So what does that organization look like? What is the next stage of growth needed?
Somewhere between, I think, $35 and $50 million of revenue, depending on the kind of business. There's a requirement for some new kind of skills and new kind of capabilities in the business that it may not have required up until that point. So, for instance, the activity of human resources, finding employees or prospects, interviewing them, doing reference checking, helping them to learn what it is they need to do for their job, getting them oriented to the business and the company and the environment, and then dealing with all of the issues that employees may have as they're looking for opportunities or training or development or issues with their fellow employees. So that activity called human resources doesn't become significant enough until you get to at least 35 and maybe even closer to $50 million, when the organization realizes that those activities, recruiting, interviewing, reference checking, doing development, helping them with career and focus, is actually being spread in too many different places in the organization and with too many different kinds of people. So you start to see on the org structure a box showing up called human resources. Maybe a director, maybe a manager, but that activity now becomes an important part of what the business does, because the revenue and particularly the amount of employees they have now requires more knowledge, more competency, and more professionalism in that space. Another one I see often is marketing. And in the early stages of a business, marketing is something that is not really perceived as being different than selling. And so the early days, business development or selling becomes, well, it's usually one of the most important things they do, because in the absence of a sale, we don't have much of a business. So people automatically take marketing and they kind of connect it to selling and think that that's being cared for properly. And what they realize as their business grows and different kinds of needs show up with their clients that they're asked to serve or need to serve, they recognize that my Mickey Mouse definition of selling and marketing starts to become more clear for them. So I see selling as getting rid of what you have, and marketing is having what you can get rid of. So when you get that distinction between those two things, the organization realizes that we need to separate those activities and get somebody who really understands marketing. How do we find places for a product? How do we develop a new product? Where's there a need in the marketplace where somebody's not meeting it or current competition's not meeting it? Or how can we create a need for something that we can do and that will be more valuable to our customers or our clients out in the marketplace? So suddenly you get this activity called marketing that becomes a job or a part, eventually a department within an organization, and it gets separated from the sales or business development activity. So that's a sign of sophistication. A business is understanding that it needs to be more attentive to this idea of where is their opportunity, not just going and finding a sale every day, but where is there opportunity we can expand into, we can develop a product or a service to meet that need, maybe do it better than existing competitors are if they're doing that at all. So you start to see that kind of sophistication showing up in a business as well. And so the top line of an organization starts to become more diverse in terms of the people that report to the president and or a CEO if that happens to be the position. But one of the most difficult things I think for organizations to wrestle with is this idea of what are the strategic activities in our business? And when they try to think about the answer to that question, oftentimes they think that everything is strategic. And so at some point you have to say, okay, well, do you think is accounting a strategic activity and every business has accounting. So is that a strategic activity? Most people in that less than 20 million for sure, and sometimes even in the $50 million size would say, yeah, accounting is strategic. We don't know what things are costing and how much money we're making, we're in trouble. And I say, okay, well, I agree that accounting is an important activity, but I don't think it's strategic. I think financial management is strategic, but accounting is not. It's a service that financial management provides. So can we all agree financial management is strategic, accounting is important? So when they start to understand their business in that kind of a fashion, then we can start to say, okay, we don't need to have every accounting function reporting to the president. We maybe just need one accounting position called the Vice President of Finance or Director of Finance that reports to that president position. So it's learning to understand your business. And you could say safety as well in the construction industry, in the manufacturing industry, in the oil field services industry, in the oil industry. This role called safety is critical. Many of the big oil companies won't let you onto their sites to do work of any kind unless you have a very specialized safety record in all of your equipment and labor and manpower and specialist kind of activities. So it's critical for them to get business. But is it a strategic activity? And most organizations, as they work their way through that, say, no, it's important. But no, it's not strategic. So we don't need to have a vice president of safety. We need to have someplace a manager of safety in our org structure, but we probably don't need to have a vice president of safety. So it's this idea of trying to understand what are our current strategic activities that we have in our business. And then as we morph into a $50 million or a $60 or an $80 million business, will there be some new strategic activities that we'll need to be conscious of and make sure we have a leader for those? Because all the strategic activities need to have a leader, and that leader has to report to the president or the CEO.
All right, there are a couple of questions that I have in my mind as we expand on this. And maybe the first one is, what are the strategic activities most important to an organization as they're going through this growth process, and then when do they show up, generally speaking? So you've already talked about sales and marketing. When does finance become a strategic activity instead of just accounting? At what points do these typically come into play?
I would say that the role called Vice President of Finance, reporting directly to a president, that position probably wouldn't show up in an org chart until somewhere in that $40 to $50 million range. Up until that point, you can have a controller in an organization or a senior accountant at a lesser revenue level and still accomplish the same things in terms of financial management and accounting activities. So a vice president of finance, somewhere in that $40 to $50 million and past that point. In many organizations today, and probably particularly smaller organizations that are less than $50 million or even less than $100 million in revenue, they create a position in their org chart called a CFO, Chief Financial Officer. And it's been really puzzling to me as to why an organization that's doing $30 million worth of revenue has to have a Chief Financial Officer. So the position of a Chief Financial Officer really came about as a consequence of a public company and the regulations that are required to be met by a public company in terms of reporting and accuracy and reflecting certain kind of accounting principles and how their costing and their revenue is reported and how shares and share value is created. So that to me is really the principal purpose of a CFO. But yet so many small businesses have this position called CFO. And most of the time when I ask about why they have that position, it's because they think that's the title they need to have in order to attract somebody to their company. So apparently accountants don't want to do accounting, they want to be a chief financial officer, I think is what they're saying. And so they've learned that if we don't put this title of chief financial officer, we're not going to get somebody who's really good at accounting and probably good at financial management as well. So the problem is that when you have a chief financial officer in an organizational structure, do you need to have a chief human resources officer? Do you need to have a chief sales sales officer. So you create this artificial structure where one position is somewhat elevated from its peers in the structure because they have this chief title inside it. So it's kind of an awkward structure for other peers to fit into because they're not quite sure whether or not that CFO is above them or equal to them on the org structure, even though it looks like they're all on the same line when you look at the structure on a diagram. So it's a part of the maturation process of a business to understand that the chief financial officer probably doesn't need to appear in our org chart for quite a long time before we actually need that. And if we appoint somebody into that job that reports directly to the president and everybody else that does is a vice president, we're kind of communicating something to the vice president, and that is, you're not quite the level of value to me as this chief financial officer is. So it's not a really good message to be communicating to people when really that chief financial officer is effectively a vice president of finance.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And again, it's not cart before the horse. Again, it's creating that awkward situation where people go, hold on a sec, who do I report to here? And what is this other position? What does that mean for me? Built on probably ego more than anything else. Again, coming back to what you said in the last episode about the organization comes first. And if that organization comes first, then no one position is going to be taking too high a priority in this organization, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So what are again other positions as we're growing this organization past 40, 50, 60 million dollars? What is another strategic position that needs to be thought of very specifically or taken time for?
In the last 10 years, this idea of technology and its impact and its usefulness in enterprises has escalated considerably. I think a good deal of that is because there is so many more choices for organizations to have what's some kind of an enterprise resource system where they can put all of their data into it, their costing, their purchasing, their hours, their labor, their compensation, and find ways to get all of that data synthesized and organized so that something comes out of it that has a useful measurement or forecast dimension for them. So this idea of how to incorporate technology into your business is not just a matter of your website, although that's for sure one way that it should show up. It's how do we make customers accessing our product or our service, how do we make that process easier for them? Why don't we take what we've got, if it's a product or even a service, and find a way for us to put a button on our website so they can click that button and then through the back door they can see our products, they can see our inventory, they can see our pricing, they can see our delivery availability if it's something that needs to be shipped or sent. So strategic clients are becoming much more focused on how do we find the pieces of technology that can really enable our business to be not only better measured in all the things that we do, but also better serving our clients and better serving our leadership so that we can see when there's a problem more quickly, we can identify the location and issue around that problem, whether it's inside or outside, and therefore we can more quickly and proactively decide how we're going to respond to it or fix it or repair it or change it. So I see technology as something that is emerging as a almost across-the-board requirement, regardless of the industry that we're working with, and at some point almost regardless of the size of the company we're working with, because you can start this off quite easy with just the website accessibility for both prospective customers, current customers, and even your staff with the intranet version of how the website can serve your current employees or future employees. So I think technology is something that, as time goes on, is going to become strategically more important to businesses. In some companies, it's already strategically important, and you'll see a chief technology officer or some kind of a position like that shows up in the org structure. But that's often well past the $100 million revenue kind of a level before that type of a position and the department and the people underneath it actually show up in an organization.
I just did a training session with some really small entrepreneurs that focused on search answer optimization. Instead of SEO, it's AO, because with large language models and everything coming down the pike, with how everything is changing. Now, instead of going to Google and seeing web pages, it starts with an AI answer to your question, and how that is changing how websites are accessed and what is more dependable information. And something that comes to mind as you talk about tech is that there's an aspect where some organizations are doing this because they don't want to be left behind. Coming back to your strategic planning ideas, there's a different way of looking at this, and that is, how do we lead the field in something? How do we become disruptive? Something that I've seen in the last decade is that the banking or financial services sector, where banking has changed completely. In the end, I can now scan my check and it is deposited into my account, which changes now how many employees we need in any number of branches, because we are not processing that information in the same way, and how disruptive that can be. And usually it's not from the major 5 banks that we're going to see disruptive type processes like this, or strategic thinking this way. So yeah, I think about that and go, wow, what an opportunity for an organization that's thinking strategically and ahead 3 to 5 years in the future. Instead of worrying about being left behind, now they're leading the field in certain ways, or disrupting their industry in certain ways.
We have a client in British Columbia who we've been working with for some time now. They're in the construction business. They have a civil construction team that does roads and site work and earthwork. They have a building division that just does commercial industrial kind of structures, and then they have an industrial division that works on plant sites and gold mines and places where there's heavy civil and heavy structure kind of work on it. So this company is led by an entrepreneur guy who is very, well, what I would call a high-tech guy. And so it was interesting to see, as we worked our way through strategy processes over the years, how he kept introducing this higher degree of technology into a company that moves dirt around every day or builds buildings every day. So they got to the place where in their civil work, when they're moving large masses of earth, either excavating things or moving things onto a site in preparation to go under a foundation or under a floor slab of some kind, they have to measure the quantities that they excavate, or measure the quantities that they bring on site, or measure the quantities that they put into a particular excavation as a base for something. So he introduced drone measurement into their company. It was the first of its kind in British Columbia. So he found drones that they could program to fly over the site every day and measure with laser measurements the actual volumes of the material that was being excavated out of the site or that was being brought into the site. So they could send their client exact invoicing every day for all the material moved or all the material brought on site. Prior to that, he would have 2 guys with a survey instrument and a survey rod that would run around all these excavations and these piles, taking measurements all over the place, then go back to their office, put it on a drawing, then do all kinds of volume calculations with it. So it took them a day to build an invoice for what they had just finished doing in excavation or material to site. Now that technology, by the time that drone gets back to the office, it's calculated all of those things. They pull it out of the hardware from it, add it into their invoice and into their project report, and send off the invoice to the client. So there's a good way that technology is changing that kind of an industry in a significant way.
It's fascinating because it comes out faster than I keep up with the news right now. Like you said, in the last decade, things have changed dramatically. Let's go back to the main idea of the podcast episode here, and that is, we're at 20 million revenue. What are the next strategic hurdles that an organization needs to think about, again, ahead of time, strategically, rather than playing catch up? You talked about the $35 to $50 million range. After that, what is the, again, next significant gap or leap or tier?
I would say probably somewhere around 70 million. A $50 million, if you have an org structure for a $50 million business, it's unlikely that you will need any more direct reports to the president. So if you've achieved $50 million in revenue, probably doesn't matter what kind of a business or industry that you're in. If you have, you've already figured out that business development or marketing or human resources or operations or engineering or something like that is those are our key strategic activities. So the difference between perhaps a $50 million structure and a $70 million structure will be not so much the boxes that report to the president, but all of the roles underneath those boxes. So it's kind of like adding more depth to the industry. So by adding a few more project managers or a few more business development people or a few more engineers, we're going to be able to produce more and get us up to that $70 million range. And then somewhere probably around 70 to 80 million, there might be a new strategic activity that shows up. And now we need to have that position reporting to the president, and then whatever team of people need to show up underneath that position. So that structure has a fair amount of extendability to it, because it's not just the horizontal, it's much more the vertical depth, building the competency within those areas and the depth within those areas. And I think the same thing, once you get up to about that $100 million level, you could probably take that same structure to $130 million, maybe even 140, before you get a new report to the president, a new strategic activity that needs a vice president kind of level. So it's the earlier stages. It's kind of like up to the $50 million size, where the greatest amount of growth shows the regular sort of requirement to have a vice president in charge of and responsible for a strategic activity. But once that model, that backbone is set, it can go for quite a while before we need to change it. But we need to keep putting that depth inside the business and add more specialty roles and more roles into the structure.
This is emphasizing how important it is to think strategically, again, those 3 to 5 year plans, so that the org chart is in place by the time companies are hitting these milestones, so that they can tweak things, they can add little bits rather than having to completely redesign everything, which can be really disruptive at this point. Sorry, I'm going to need a second. I had another question that I'm going to wait.
Part of this process of org design is getting the owner or the entrepreneur or the partners very comfortable and believing that they don't have to take that person who was a good site safety officer and that was the only person they have, and make them the manager of safety or the vice president of safety. So it's them kind of having that same business maturity experience, where they're realizing that safety officer is a really important person in our business. We absolutely need them, but we don't need to move them up the ladder to the place that we call that a vice president or a director or even a manager kind of a level. So not only is there a need to understand the strategic activities in the business, it's making sure that we're not trying to take an individual and promote them to some level where they are no longer going to be as effective as they are. That's a struggle, as we talked about earlier in our conversation, where we feel this obligation as owners and entrepreneurs because we hired those people, we like those people, they're loyal to us, we're committed to them, they do good work every day. We want to reward that. We want to acknowledge that. And the way we do that often as owners and entrepreneurs is giving them a promotion, and with that some more compensation, and probably also some more responsibility. So owners oftentimes are very guilty of creating that problem for that individual by trying to reward their loyalty and their competency and giving them more responsibility, only to find out that it's not working as well as it used to. So it's really important for owners and entrepreneurs to learn that as soon as they can in the development of their business, not wait until 2 or 3 or 4 of those things have happened and realize that they've missed something in their own maturation process, and recognize that person will do it because you've asked them to do it, only to find out that they're not doing it the way that it needs to be done, and now they're disappointed and you're disappointed. That'll give you some time to think about your question.
Yeah, that's excellent. With this organization now growing, and I don't know which question I want to ask, so I'm going to ask a couple. You take what is more appropriate, okay? What is the better question? So one question that comes to mind is, what are the tools or help that an organization can use to now grow past that 40, 50, 60, $70 million mark? Or in another way, how does the leadership team need to change how they think strategically about the next period of growth? What's the better question there?
How they think about growth.
Okay, let's tackle that then.
Yeah. So if you're doing a business that has say, 4 different kinds of products that you sell, and they're products that you've created, that you own. They're your intellectual property. And so those 4 products, as you are developing your business, start to show some kind of a pattern of attractiveness and value to your customers. And you see where maybe 2 of those products are always at the top of the list every month in terms of the amount of sales that we're making with them. And then the 3rd one is perhaps lagging a bit, but not too far away. And the 4th one seems to be always the last one and the lowest one every month and every year. And over a period of time, we see this pattern of where, 2 are really nailing it out of the park every day, or knocking it out of the park every day. The 3rd one is doing okay, but why is it not showing more? And the 4th one just seems to be barely changing, but there's always that little bit of business that comes inside it. So it's really important for as they're thinking about the future, is to say, okay, so if these 2 products are the ones that are being purchased the most and valued the most by our clients, how do we grow that part of our business by 50% or 100% in the next 3 or 4 years? And then what do we do with this business, this product that's only representing maybe 10% of our revenue and not even that much of our profit? What do we do with that one? That's a very difficult position. When you created that product, it's your intellectual property, it's proprietary, and now you're looking at it and realizing that it's not really an important part of our business anymore. So as we look ahead, what we're going to do is make 2 decisions. We want to escalate the growth of these 2 because clearly they're valuable and important and profitable to us, and we're learning how to make them more efficiently, so that's adding to our profitability. The 3rd one, we're going to see if we can focus that in this way to see if we can get that product up to a same kind of a level of performance. We think that maybe with some tweaks on that product, we can make it way more valuable and useful to current and future clients. And this other one that has always been the lowest producer, we're going to probably just retire that product. Maybe we'll keep some parts and pieces around for people who still want to repair the ones they have that we sold to them, but we're not going to make any more of those. So we're going to focus our future on these areas right here. So immediately that brings clarity to them. Now they know that we've got to get really good at selling these 2 things to more people. Where are we going to do that? Well, right now we're kind of just based in Edmonton, and we're selling in kind of Red Deer to Fort McMurray, and so we see that marketplace is really good, but we've never really sold anything to anybody in Calgary or anybody in Grand Prairie. Why haven't we done that? Our product's not expensive to ship. We could actually have a warehouse there if we want. Why don't we have a warehouse there and somebody in there who can deliver the product when it's purchased from our Edmonton website, and they'll show up the next day in their truck with the product? So they're starting to think about how we expand our business from a geographical perspective. We want to sell more of these things. We know there are clients in Grand Prairie. We know there are clients in Calgary. Why have we not reach them? What can we do about reaching them? So now this idea of infrastructure. Where do we get a warehouse? Where do we find somebody? What kind of inventory do we put there? Should we have a salesperson there at some point that's also reaching people every day rather than just using our website? So all of that then becomes more clear for them. They build a plan about how to do those things. We want to open up an office in Grand Prairie this year. We want to open an office in Calgary next year. We're going to have this kind of inventory here and there. That's all now part of their strategy, and everybody sees how that's going to expand and strengthen their business and give them the kind of growth that they're looking for.
Whenever we say yes to something, we're saying no to something else. So what you're bringing out here is that if there are these 4 products, and the 4th product really really becomes difficult, as if that 4th product was the original product of the company or something, right? Because then it's the baby, it's the child of the company. But if we can say no to that product, even though it's middling along, if we say no to that, we can now double down on those products. It reminds me of is it called the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, where if often it's the 20% of our organization or our efforts or our time or energy that produce far more results, 80% of our revenue or whatever it is. But that's really what you're getting at. And it reminds me of something else, which is with products, we have to say no to certain things to increase productivity and revenue in other areas. We've talked about saying no to certain products to double down on the more important items because they're taking up too much revenue and creating risk in certain areas of business. Maybe explore that. I'm probably asking it poorly here, but explore that whole area. I've seen you do this in strategic planning sessions before, but what is the danger, and at what point does one client or customer taking up too much of our revenue percentage become a problem for an organization?
Yeah, good. That's a question that probably every business struggles with as they grow and mature, especially. So let's think about it from a different perspective for a moment. So if you're the owner of a business, or your partners in ownership in a business, what do you want to achieve in the ownership of this business? Most entrepreneurs and owners will say, well, at some point I want to sell this business. So I want to make it valuable and attractive enough to be able to sell to somebody. And so that means you're going to need to have a bit of a pattern of continuous growth in revenue, some kind of continuous growth in profitability, some kind of a development of expertise within your organization to do what you do in a better way and to be able to do more of those things. Enough credibility in terms of getting the 4 stars out of 5 or the 9 stars out of 10 from your customers in the quality of what you do and your customer service capabilities and attentiveness. So if you try to take that business to the marketplace at some point to sell it, and you've been working this for 10 years or 20 years at this point, and you have half of your revenue coming from one customer, and that customer started off as maybe 5 or 10% of your business, so right off the bat they were a big customer, but now 10 or 20 years later, that customer represents 50% of our business. And it may not be that customer in one location. It may be a customer who has multiple facilities and locations, and all of those facilities and locations are buying your product or buying your service. But collectively, when you put them together, they're almost 50% of your revenue. So now a buyer for your business puts their hand up and says, I'm interested in looking at it. And they start doing some due diligence, and they say, so 50% of your revenue is coming from one customer, yeah. So what would happen if you lost that customer? Or what happens if that customer only decides to buy half as much from you because now I, as the new owner of your business, don't have the same relationship with that customer that you've invested 10 or 20 years with. So now that business is at risk of being sellable. It might be buyable when you look at all of the performance and all of the revenue numbers and the profitability and the expansion of products. So it looks like it's very buyable. But then when you look at the components of it, the composition of that, and you realize there's a huge risk here, because if I buy this business and that customer decides to change their mind, I have a huge problem on my hand. So I try to present that picture with the entrepreneurs and owners to help them to understand some point down the road that conversation will take place. You don't want to be educated by a potential buyer when they tell you that 50% is too much, it's too much risk, I can't buy your business. I'm glad that they're a good customer, but I'm worried that I would have some risk if they don't like me or they decide to find another supplier for some reason. So 10%, maybe 20% of your revenue can come from one client, but I would suggest no more than that, because you have to remember that day that I want to sell this business and the consequences of somebody evaluating that in a different way than you do. You want the revenue as an owner. You want the profitability that comes with that as an owner. And so you're willing to perhaps, forego the future problem for the immediate value and reward you get by continuing to grow your business with this good customer or this good client. So it's important in this maturation process, the strategic development of the business, to make sure they don't have any customer that has more than that amount of revenue. So what that does is it forces you in a good way to learn how to find new customers. Where do we go and find these customers to make sure that we have lots of customers and none of them represent more than 10% of our business? So now we have to build our selling skills, our selling muscle, our marketing skills, our marketing muscle to go and find new products, new markets, and new customers to sell our products to. So that's a critical part of building an entrepreneurial business that is sellable.
One way I think about this, because I'm a real estate guy, is if I have a duplex versus if I have a 100 unit apartment building. If I have a duplex and I'm vacant for 1 month, I am now bringing 50% of my revenue into the business. If I've got a 100 unit building and I'm missing 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 tenants, does it make a difference? It makes a difference, but it's insignificant. It is not, I shouldn't say that. It is not as detrimental to my organization, my business, if I'm missing rent from 1 or 2 of 100 versus 50%. And I think about objections that an organization might bring up at this point of saying, well, yeah, but DeWayne, that this one customer can bring in now bigger fish that allow me to grow in a completely different way, where they're all going to take up 10%, but I've got many more fish. When somebody's bringing up other objections to you, or maybe the way I'll ask this is, are there times where this is okay to take that next step or to grow in some other way? Or do we need to completely design a strategic plan in lowering the amount of revenue we percentage-wise from one customer? Where would you go with that? How would you challenge people? How would you help them?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of options strategically that a business can have. One of them is to say, we don't want to change the amount of revenue we're doing with that business because they really are a valuable, powerful client. So what we want to do is build up the rest of the business so that doesn't become as much of it. And so now that becomes our focus. We already know we have this client. We continue to offer them good service, attentiveness, and special kind of problem solving for them when they need that from us. We're going to continue doing that. But what we're going to really become strategically focused on now is going to find a whole bunch more customers so that volume doesn't any longer represent 50% of our business. Very seldom do you want to say from a strategic perspective, we're not going to sell as much to that customer so that they don't represent 50% of our business. That probably wouldn't be very wise. So the idea then is to say, let's not stop that. Let's just build the rest of the marketplace in a way that is very strategically focused for us, so that day when it comes for us to sell our business, we've addressed that problem already. And in the meantime, we're making something that's not only more sellable and buyable, but way more valuable to the person or the company that's going to acquire this from us as well.
So an organization in this situation could be like, okay, I'm hearing DeWayne. The next huge piece of our strategy planning is going to be let's build out our business. Let's find enough clients that this 50% becomes 10%. And when it's 10%, we're just all the better off in every area. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense to me. What other areas, again, what are some other problems that you've seen at that level, maybe $60, $80 million of revenue, where you see certain things creeping into a business or something that has become a bigger deal than it might have been a couple of years back as an organization has grown?
Yeah, there's definitely patterns that you see when you're exposed to enough of these kind of situations. And a couple of things that I've noticed, this idea of communications, internal communications, seems to deteriorate as you get larger. When the business is small and the owner can go and talk to people, or the partners can go and engage with people every day to some extent or another, communications seem to work well, and everybody seems to be on the same page, and there's clarity about where we're going or why we're doing something or why we're not doing something. But as you get larger, it becomes obviously difficult to do that. So you start to see different kinds of communication problems showing up. There's employees who are saying, well, we're not really sure if this is important or that's important. Nobody's really proclaimed that to us, so we're kind of doing both of them the same way. Or other people will say, well, those salespeople, they're kind of irritating because they come inside here and they want us to do something right now, and if we don't do it right now, their customer is going to be unhappy. We're going to lose a customer. They're not going to get their commitment. So there's all this tension that starts when one part of the business is trying to manage another part of the business, and the communication breaks down because the salesperson's primarily only interested in making that sale, and that's a good thing. That's the right thing. And they're motivated to do whatever it has to be done in the business to make sure that happens. In the meantime, that person who's supposed to be delivering or making that product or providing that service has a boss who's not the salesman's boss, and that boss is saying, this is my priority, this is what I need you to do. So now you start to get this communication problems and tensions. What's interesting about that is that there is no perfect solution to communication problems in business. So I can remember from 20 years ago surveying employees in an organization before we did strategy work with them to uncover and understand and define issues and opportunities with the business. And we'll have 20 or 30 or 40, 50 people do that before we have a strategy session. And then gathering that data and evaluating it and trying to see what are the core issues. Communication seems to always be on that list, along with probably 4 or 5 other things. And it doesn't matter whether it's a $10 million business or a $300 million business, communications is always a problem. So then when you think about this from a very personal level, what are the main struggles that a husband and wife have in their relationship? And oftentimes it's communications. One's not saying something to the other, one's not saying everything to the other, one's not listening. And so that same thing manifests itself in an enterprise, except with a whole bunch more people inside it. So there is no perfect solution to communications. There's only ongoing investment and development and intentionality about it. And over the years, you can see the elevation of it go from maybe the top of the list or the second list to the 7th or the 8th, but it's always on the list. So we as humans don't seem to ever master that communication issue. And the larger the business, oftentimes the more complex and difficult it becomes. So I think communications is across the board a challenge for business, and I've never seen one that doesn't have that problem.
Yeah, I think about how maybe the goal in the strat plan is to make that 6th or 7th place consistently rather than 1st or 2nd, rather than eliminate it completely.
Yeah, and so what organizations realize is that as they're growing, as there's more employees and more strategic activities that have their own specialists inside them, they realize that this idea of having team meetings or having department meetings or having corporate meetings, having team communications, corporate communications becomes a really important part of what they have to do just for their own staff, not even for the clients or the marketplace they're dealing with. So they become much more intentional about having scheduled meetings, agendas for them, topics people can add to them. We get feedback on them. We get action plans from them. So this whole process of becoming just more intentional about talking about things, getting people together, listening to voices, taking positions, taking action plans, just becomes now a part of their DNA. And that's when you see the communication start to move lower on the list. Not ever perfectly solved, but absolutely lower on the list. Another one that is very, very difficult to deal with, but also very often present in organizations, is this thing called morale. And morale is something that we all we understand the presence of it and we understand the absence of it, but we're not really sure how to measure it. And we're not really sure what creates high morale. We probably have some idea of what creates poor or low morale, but how do we fix morale? So if we say we're 6 on a 10-point scale today, how do we get to 8? And can we ever achieve 10? And is 10 worthwhile to achieve? Do we want to spend the time and money and effort to be a 10 in that? So most organizations would probably be happy with a 7 or an 8, and if they could maintain it at that level on a scale, it's probably very good for the business and for the individuals in the business. But organizations that are a 4 or 5 need some serious focus on what it is that they're doing. And morale has lots of components to it. Communications is one big one that's a part of it. But this idea of management competency becomes much more important for morale. If you have a manager that on a good day is only a 5 or a 6 at being a manager on a 10-point scale, the people that are working in that area will regularly feel like they're not being managed properly or supervised properly, or that manager is not competent at doing this or that, so we don't go to that person for those things anymore. We go to somebody else or consult each other. And so we're regularly finding ourselves not happy with the way that our manager is managing us, either their communication, their style, their personality, whatever it may be, their competency in doing what they're doing. So fixing morale is a very complex thing to do, but organizations need to be very aware of the consequences of that. It causes people to leave your business, probably more than anything else. If you're going to work and you're dissatisfied or unhappy for too long, you're going to start looking at where are there places that I can go and work at, because this is painful every day. I'm not happy when I go home. So it becomes something that is strategic, because it's a reason why people will either not be productive or accountable, or they'll find a reason to leave the business. So you have to be intentional about saying, understand what is it in our environment that's creating this morale problem. Supervision and management is often one of those things. Compensation is another one. We haven't been rewarding people for their performance. As our business has gotten better, we've not been intentional about finding ways to reward our people, to say to them, we're doing better and we want you to do better as a consequence of that. Opportunity for career development, training. Those are things that really have a very big impact on morale when an individual, so this idea of career development, opportunity to grow, training, building my knowledge, building my skills, building my competency, those are really important to almost every employee in every kind of organization. And not everybody aspires to want to be a supervisor, manager, and executive, but everybody wants to have some kind of growth, that they feel like they're becoming more valuable in the world, more competent, more skillful, more knowledgeable about things. So if an organization's not intentional about making sure that those needs that the individuals have has some way of being addressed, and we can't train everybody all the time, and we can't give everybody career development opportunities, but we've got to find some way to be respectful of that and also to be invested in that. And so that becomes a strategic activity in the business, not one that needs a vice president, but one that becomes important for all of our leaders to be focused on, regardless of what part of the business they're in. And I've seen over the years where organizations have realized that and then taken the steps, made the investment, built into the job descriptions of managers and executives this requirement to give people feedback on their performance, to give them opportunities to try some new things, to invest in them from a training perspective, to give them time to be a supervisor for a week when the supervisor's on vacation so they can learn some new muscles and some new kind of perspective on the business. When they're intentional about doing that and genuine about doing that, you can see the morale scores rise in the organization because people are realizing that I'm important, my growth and contribution is important, and people are giving me that opportunity. And so that has a very positive effect on how people feel about the business, feel about their boss, feel about their colleagues. And so that morale score, if you will, improves, and the organization sees the benefit of that. People work harder.
Something that's becoming very clear to me as we've done these last two episodes is that there are certain problems that every organization is going to go through at certain stages that we need to figure out as organizations. But as we grow past certain points, if somebody comes to you and says, hey, how do we grow? The answer will be, it depends. Let's delve deeper into this. Let's learn a bit more about what you're specifically struggling with, because the things that we know help every organization, you might be struggling with in a different way. The morale or the communication, the way we will solve some of these issues might look a little bit different than other organizations at some points in time. A word that you used moments ago was intentionality or intention. And something that came to my mind back when I was working toward becoming a psychologist, an idea that really jumped out to me about humans was that it's a very large number. It's something like 80% or more of our tasks or decisions are done on autopilot. And that makes things efficient on some level, and it's needed on some level to be intentional about absolutely every little decision that we make in life every day would make it insane. Which foot do I put this sock on first? So that should be done on autopilot. Having said that, intentionality is something that I think humans struggle with, again, to be intentional about the most important things in life. And a picture that's kind of becoming clear to me in throughout our conversations is that if an organizational leader plans strategically with intention, their organization is going to grow in very unique ways compared to the average organization. So maybe I don't even have a question with that, DeWayne. Maybe what I'll do is just open that thought up to you. Take it where you want to go.
I think the purpose of strategy is to cause a business to do something it's not doing now. Maybe more of something, less of something, different place, different way. But the purpose of strategy is to cause a business to do something it's not doing now. Some of that will be things they've never done before, like go to a place that they've not sold something, or develop a product that they don't have and they create it for a need in the marketplace. And some of it will be to fix things in the business that aren't working very well, like communications or like morale or like the use of technology or like the monitoring and measurement of different kinds of performance and costs and within the business. So this idea of strategy, its purpose is to cause you to do things you're not doing today in order for your business to become better. So if you're not doing them today, what causes you to start doing them tomorrow. So if you just continue on with autopilot, I think that's a really good way to describe this, then you're not going to do the things that have to be done that are new and you haven't done before. So the only way we do those things is when we're intentional about something. We say, okay, I see where communications is a problem in my department as a vice president, and I got that feedback from our strategy process, and I get that feedback from our management surveys that we do within our business and our engagement surveys with our staff. I see that that's a problem in my area. So what I'm going to do as vice president of this division is I'm going to become more intentional about communicating with people. I'm going to do that through meetings. I'm going to do that through some one-on-ones. I'm going to do that with some emails. I'm going to find ways to do things I'm not doing today to make sure that this communications matter improves within my department. The only way I'm going to do that is by becoming intentional about that. And so now I put it on my calendar to say, go talk to somebody today, go have lunch with somebody today, whatever it is that I need to prompt me and remind me that that's something I need to do, because I don't normally do that. And strategy is requiring me to do something different that I haven't done before. So that's where this idea of intentionality becomes critical for an organization to actually become more effective and grow their business. It's only when you're doing things different that you create growth. If you just keep doing the same things all the time, at some point that runway will come to an end. So it's finding the new things we need to do to make sure that runway always has lots of space in front of us.
In some ways, the way you're using intentionality is, where do we place our focus? And if we place our focus on the most important places, which throughout this conversation has been on strategy, long-term strategy, rather than, again, the bandage that fixed some problem for today but pops up again in a bigger way tomorrow. If we place our focus as leaders on the right things in business, that it makes everything else smoother in the end. It doesn't mean that it will be smooth. It doesn't mean that it'll be easy, but we can now have a plan that goes forward in a way that reaches the business's goals, rather than accidentally moving along in business. DeWayne, thank you so much for this. I know that there's so much value for me, but I'm absolutely certain that this is going to be helping organizations in really unique ways that maybe haven't thought about the right thing. Again, your experience, the plethora of your experience and the variety of your experiences brings so much value to an organization struggling with a specific problem. And I know that we didn't go into the nitty-gritty too much. We've talked about larger, broader concepts. Having said that, I think it provides a framework for organizations so that they can think about what they specifically need for their organization. So on behalf of a lot of other organizations, I'm sure right now, thank you so much for doing this.
Can I just say one more thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we can weave this into some other part of what we just finished talking about. This is an experience that I had a few weeks ago with a client in Calgary that's $1.3 billion in size, and they're international in scope. I was doing some work with a leadership team, the CEO and the VPs and the chief operating officers, the CFO, around the strategy conversation and also around leadership capability within the organization. And what was interesting for me to learn in that, because it's just so recent, it's only a few weeks old for me, was the problems they have as a $1.3 billion international business is not very different than a $100 million business that I work with every day. So at some point in your growth trajectory, it doesn't matter what size is, those same kind of issues keep repeating themselves. So it's really good to learn how to deal with those things earlier in your business career and in your enterprise growth than it is to wait until you get to $1.3 billion in size. They have those problems today.
If you build your muscle earlier on, you'll be able to utilize that muscle in more efficient ways. Yeah. Excellent.
All right.
With every guest that we have on this podcast, with every episode that we're producing, it goes in a different direction than what I expect. And even though DeWayne and I planned a lot of this out, even though we've talked about a lot of it, there were so many unique aspects that came up that I really appreciated. Just to kind of summarize at least the last couple of episodes here, really, and if you didn't listen to the first episode of the last two, the third episode of this series, please go back and listen to that as well, because it set the framework for the fourth episode here. In summary, what again stands out to me is the importance of doing things that are difficult to do in business, primarily because they're difficult to do as human beings. We developed as a species to focus on what I need today, hunting, gathering, whatever it was. And when we can take a step back from that, when leaders can take a step back from that and focus on what we need tomorrow, next year, 3 to 5 years from now, that's really what starts to separate the most successful businesses from those that are figuring things out but struggling through it. Again, one last thing that I'm going to throw out to you, as always, is if you're curious about something that we talked about, we've got this new format with video, but if you're curious about something specifically that we talked about, reach out, ask a question. This is a commitment that I make to anybody that I'm communicating with. There are a lot of things that I don't know, but if you ask the question of Concord or myself, we will work to find that answer for you, even if I don't know immediately. Thanks for taking the time to even view this or listen to this, because it makes a difference for your business. And this is what often makes it profitable for me to do stuff like this, is that it's valuable because people are learning, growing. And again, the focus of all of these episodes is how to perform at a higher level. How do you get to peak performance? How do you perform at a higher level? So important for all organizations. And it's very satisfying to see as organizations grow. Thank you.